The Japanese Navy in 1941 measured strength in battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. They believed naval supremacy rested on steel hulls, big guns, and the ability to project force across the Pacific. What they did not foresee was how wooden boats, barely 80 feet long, armed with a few torpedoes, machine guns, and reckless crews, would begin to carve away at their logistical lifelines. These boats, designated Patrol Torpedo craft or PT boats, would earn the nickname the Mosquito Fleet. Small, fast, and seemingly expendable, they would go on to destroy nearly 200 Japanese vessels during the war. The idea of the PT boat had taken root years earlier in U.S. naval circles, inspired partly by British and Italian fast attack craft of the First World War. Yet when war clouds gathered over the Pacific, many admirals remained unconvinced. Could plywood hulls survive against destroyers and cruisers? Could forward torpedoes slung from deck mounts truly matter in a theater dominated by carrier air power? For many in Washington, PT boats looked like a distraction from serious naval planning. But others, like Admiral Harold Betty Stark and the Bureau of Ships, saw in them a cheap, mobile weapon that could serve in the shallow waters of the Pacific's island chains. By late 1941, contracts had been issued to 3 builders: Elko in Bayonne, New Jersey, Higgins Industries in New Orleans, and Huckins in Jacksonville, Florida. The Elko 80-footer would become the most common, though Higgins' rugged 78-footers proved equally vital. They were powered by 3 Packard Marine engines, each delivering 1,350 horsepower, capable of pushing the boats past 40 knots. Their light construction gave them speed, but made them vulnerable to even small-caliber fire. Crews, often just 12 to 17 men, lived cramped, hot, and dangerous lives. Their weapons fit was modest: torpedoes, a 20mm Ehrlichen, twin .5 caliber machine guns, but their strength lay in surprise and mobility. Japanese naval planners hardly noticed their arrival. In 1941, Tokyo's emphasis lay on massive, decisive battles, in line with Mahanian doctrine. The Mosquito boats seemed irrelevant in the face of the combined fleet's battleships and carriers. As the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for Pearl Harbor, its officers dismissed the American penchant for experimental craft as symptomatic of a nation unready for total war. They could not have been more wrong. In literal waters, where destroyers were overkill, barges were lifelines, and speed mattered more than armor, PT boats would thrive. The U.S. Navy's early deployment of PT boats to the Philippines in December 1941 marked the beginning of their Pacific campaign. From bases at Cavite and later in the Bataan Peninsula, PT Squadron 3 under Lieutenant John D. Bulkley carried out night patrols against Japanese landings. The boats were too few, their torpedoes unreliable, and their missions nearly suicidal, but the precedent was set. Here was a weapon that, when multiplied across the Pacific, could inflict sustained damage. The Japanese, while frustrated by these attacks, regarded them as nuisances. They would soon discover they were far more. What gave PT boats their eventual lethality was not just hardware, but doctrine. Trained to exploit cover of darkness, to strike supply lines and to vanish before counterfire, PT crews embraced unconventional tactics. They could slip into island shallows inaccessible to destroyers, ambush barge convoys, or pounce on unsuspecting auxiliaries. For the Japanese, who relied heavily on barges to resupply isolated garrisons, this was a nightmare scenario. Slowly, the Mosquito fleet began to bite. By early 1942, the U.S. Navy's Shadow Fleet had found its identity. Though scorned at first, PT crews developed a reputation for audacity. Naval planners noted their cost-effectiveness. One PT boat cost less than a single fighter aircraft and a fraction of a destroyer's price. More importantly, they tied down disproportionate Japanese resources. A squadron of plywood craft forced destroyers, planes, and convoys to divert time and firepower. The Japanese Navy, which had not anticipated such an asymmetric threat, began to bleed in ways that its admirals could not ignore. Chapter 1 sets the stage: the arrival of America's Mosquito Fleet, underestimated and unheralded, but destined to rewrite the Pacific naval balance in ways the Japanese Navy never expected. The Pacific War began with disaster for the United States. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck the Philippines, rapidly overwhelming American and Filipino defenses. Amid the chaos, a handful of small, fast boats found themselves thrust into combat. These were the Navy's Patrol Torpedo craft, Squadron 3 under Lieutenant John D. Bulkley. With only 6 PT boats available and few spares, they faced the daunting task of defending an entire archipelago against one of the most powerful navies in the world. Stationed first at Cavite Navy Yard and later operating from makeshift bases in Bataan and Corregidor, the squadron's boats were constantly under threat. Japanese bombers targeted Cavite on December 10, 1941, destroying fuel tanks, workshops, and critical supplies. PT-32 and PT-35 barely escaped the inferno, while their crews scrambled to salvage torpedoes and ammunition. For the men of Squadron 3, the loss of their base meant fighting with dwindling resources and constant improvisation. Yet Bulkley, a brash and fearless officer, refused to concede defeat. "We'll fight them with what we've got," he later recalled, "and we'll make them pay." PT operations in the Philippines showcased both the strengths and limitations of the Mosquito Fleet. In shallow coastal waters, the boats darted between islands, laying ambushes against Japanese landing parties. On December 22, they attacked transports off Lingayen Gulf, launching torpedoes in a desperate attempt to slow the invasion. Though torpedo malfunctions plagued the squadron, many failed to detonate or ran too deep, the aggressive spirit of the crews made an impression. Japanese reports noted small enemy motor torpedo craft interfering with landings, though Tokyo's commanders dismissed them as minor irritants compared to air and artillery resistance. The most famous mission came months later in March 1942, when Bulkley's boats played a crucial role in history. General Douglas MacArthur, ordered to leave the besieged fortress of Corregidor, required safe passage through waters crawling with Japanese patrols. Bulkley's own boat carried MacArthur, his family, and key staff across the darkened seas toward Mindoro and eventually to Australia. The voyage was perilous. Engines sputtered, fuel was scarce, and Japanese destroyers prowled nearby. But the PT crews succeeded, ensuring that MacArthur would live to fulfill his promise, "I shall return." For this feat, Bulkley received the Medal of Honor, and PT boats gained sudden prominence in the American press. Despite these successes, the Philippines campaign ended in tragedy. With fuel and torpedoes nearly exhausted, the remaining boats were either scuttled or destroyed in action by April 1942. Their crews, exhausted and malnourished, often fought on as infantry after their boats were gone. Japanese officers, reviewing captured documents after the fall of Corregidor, recognized the audacity of PT tactics, but remained convinced that such fragile craft posed no lasting threat. To them, the Mosquito Fleet seemed an expendable nuisance, incapable of shaping the broader course of the war. Yet the seeds had been planted. The Philippine experience revealed how PT boats could serve as strategic tools, rescuing high-value personnel, harassing supply lines, and forcing enemy ships to operate with caution in shallow waters. Their psychological effect was disproportionate. Even when torpedoes failed, their presence alone disrupted Japanese movements. For the U.S. Navy, battered and retreating in early 1942, this was a rare source of inspiration. Newspapers back home printed stories of Bulkley and his Knights of the Sea, casting the Mosquito Fleet as a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. As the last PT remnants faded from the Philippine campaign, the lessons learned would be carried into the Solomons and beyond. The baptism of fire had proven the concept. Small, fast, aggressive boats could carve openings even in the darkest days of defeat. The Japanese Navy, still focused on grand battleships and carrier duels, had not yet understood that its lifelines of supply and reinforcement would soon become the next hunting ground for America's Shadow Fleet. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had shifted to the Solomon Islands, where the U.S. Navy launched its first major counteroffensive at Guadalcanal. The struggle for Henderson Field, jungle-clad ridges, and control of the Slot, the long, narrow channel running through the island chain, became a grinding contest of supply. For the Japanese, destroyers made nightly Tokyo Express runs to resupply troops. For the Americans, the answer increasingly came from small, nimble PT boats. In October 1942, the first PT squadrons arrived at Tulagi, across the channel from Guadalcanal. Their base was little more than a collection of tents, a few makeshift docks, and repair shops built from scavenged lumber. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer, and crews lived under constant malaria threat. Yet their mission was clear: intercept Japanese convoys under cover of darkness. Against sleek destroyers and well-trained crews, the task seemed suicidal, but the PT skippers relished the challenge. The Solomons offered the ideal hunting ground for the Mosquito fleet. The narrow channels forced Japanese supply barges and destroyers into predictable routes. PT boats, guided by coast watchers and primitive radar, would lie in wait along shorelines. When targets appeared, they darted forward at 35 knots, launching torpedoes before retreating into the blackness. Japanese sailors, unnerved by the sudden attacks, fired wildly into the night. Time and again, destroyer captains reported being forced to evade small craft, losing precious minutes and sometimes men to torpedo strikes. Still, results were uneven. Early Mark 8 torpedoes often malfunctioned, running too deep or failing to detonate. Some PT crews risked everything only to see their weapons leave no mark. Others, however, scored dramatic hits. PT-37 and PT-61 claimed multiple barge sinkings in late 1942, while PT-48 narrowly escaped destruction after tangling with Japanese destroyers near Tassafaranga. The Japanese 8th Fleet recorded steady attrition of barges, ammunition, and fuel runs. Small losses by fleet standards, but devastating for soldiers trapped ashore without supplies. The Japanese underestimated the cumulative effect. Each barge sunk meant dozens of troops stranded without rations, medicine, or ammunition. Coast Watcher reports noted hungry Japanese soldiers foraging in Guadalcanal's jungles, their supply chain broken by relentless PT ambushes. American commanders saw the boats as a force multiplier, cheap craft that tied down enemy destroyers and reduced pressure on larger U.S. warships. Rear Admiral William F. Halsey praised them as mosquitoes that never give rest. The cost was high. PT crews fought with little armor, their wooden hulls vulnerable to even machine gun fire. One burst from a Japanese destroyer could reduce a boat to splinters. Many men perished in flaming wrecks, often without rescue. Survivors told of swimming in oil-slicked water as enemy searchlights probed the waves. Yet their morale remained astonishingly high. Officers were often young, some barely out of college, commanding crews bonded by shared risk and long nights of tension. Their reputation grew as pirates of the slot, daring hunters who thrived on danger. By early 1943, PT boats had sunk or damaged dozens of Japanese barges and forced destroyers to adopt evasive routes. The Japanese Navy, already stretched thin, found itself bleeding resources to fight off a weapon it had dismissed. Reports from the 4th Air Group War Diary mentioned the irritating enemy motor torpedo craft and their growing nuisance value. What they did not admit was that these boats were slowly strangling Japan's forward garrisons. For the Mosquito fleet, Guadalcanal was both proving ground and crucible. They learned to coordinate with aircraft, to use islands as cover, and to fight in conditions where no destroyer dared linger. The campaign revealed the true value of PTs, not in grand fleet battles, but in the relentless erosion of enemy supply lines. When the Japanese finally evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, it was not just Marines and aircraft that had worn them down. It was also the nightly sting of wooden boats, whose torpedoes and audacity had left their mark on the outcome of the first great Allied victory in the Pacific. After the brutal months of Guadalcanal, the Pacific War surged north into the central Solomons. By mid-1943, PT squadrons had become an established element of the U.S. Navy's forward strategy. From newly carved bases at Rendova, New Georgia, and Vella La Vella, the Mosquito fleet pushed deeper into contested waters. Their mission remained the same: interdict Japanese supply lines, particularly the endless stream of barges that attempted to feed and reinforce isolated garrisons. In the darkness of the Solomon nights, the PT boats came into their own. The Japanese had shifted tactics after their Guadalcanal defeat. Large destroyer runs proved too costly under Allied air pressure, so they relied increasingly on smaller barges, camouflaged and hugging coastlines. These vessels carried food, ammunition, and reinforcements to stranded troops, but at a crawling pace. For PT boats, they were ideal prey. Equipped with speed and shallow draft, the American craft prowled the narrow channels, ambushing barges with torpedoes, 20mm cannons, and even small arms fire. Night after night, the Mosquito fleet turned stretches of ocean into graveyards of burning barges and splintered hulls. Japanese accounts reveal both anger and grudging respect. The war diary of the 4th Air Group complained of enemy motor torpedo craft, which appear suddenly and vanish like phantoms. Officers lamented that their soldiers ashore now faced hunger, disease, and declining morale because of persistent interdiction. Barges were cheap, but they could not be replaced quickly enough to offset losses. The Imperial Japanese Navy diverted patrol craft, aircraft, and even destroyers to hunt the PTs, but their speed and stealth often made them elusive. For every Mosquito boat lost, many more Japanese vessels were destroyed. Life for the crews remained perilous. The Mark 8 torpedoes' unreliability still haunted them, and attacks often brought them within range of Japanese shore batteries. Wooden hulls offered no protection. A single burst of 25mm fire could shred a boat in seconds. Yet the crews pressed on, driven by camaraderie and a growing belief that their small boats were making a strategic difference. In letters home, sailors described nights spent weaving through tracer fire, engines roaring, waves smashing over the bow as they closed on another target. They lived hard and fought harder. By the close of 1943, the cumulative toll was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy credited PT squadrons in the Solomons with destroying or damaging hundreds of Japanese barges and dozens of auxiliary craft. Starvation gripped isolated garrisons, undermining Japanese control of key islands. Admiral William Halsey praised their bold and invaluable service, while Tokyo's own reports acknowledged severe logistical strain. For the first time, the Japanese High Command began to understand that these insignificant motorboats were bleeding their war effort in ways battleships never could. The Mosquito fleet had proven its sting. In the night battles of 1943, PT boats transformed from an experiment into a decisive weapon of attrition. Their speed, daring, and persistence left the Japanese Navy scrambling for answers, even as the tide of war turned inexorably against them. By the summer of 1943, the Mosquito fleet was entrenched in the Central Solomons campaign. Its nightly patrols had already earned a reputation for audacity, yet it was one tragic collision that propelled PT boats into worldwide fame. This was the saga of PT-109, commanded by a young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy. PT-109 belonged to Squadron 2, stationed at Rendova. Like many boats in the area, it was assigned to patrol the waters near New Georgia and the Blackett Strait, an area heavily trafficked by Japanese destroyers and barges. Conditions were punishing: tropical heat, swarms of mosquitoes, constant mechanical breakdowns, and the unrelenting grind of nightly sorties. Kennedy, just 26 years old, had already earned respect among his crew for his calm under pressure and his willingness to share their hardships. On the night of August 1-2, 1943, PT-109 and other boats were dispatched to intercept Japanese destroyers expected to resupply garrisons. The night was moonless, visibility poor. As Kennedy maneuvered his boat at low speed to avoid detection, fate intervened. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, traveling at 30 knots, suddenly loomed out of the darkness.
Before Kennedy could react, the 2,000-ton vessel rammed PT-109 amidships, slicing the wooden craft in two. Flames and wreckage erupted across the water. 2 of Kennedy's crew died instantly. The remaining 11 clung to the shattered bow section. Amid fire and oil, Kennedy gathered his men and began the arduous process of survival. Knowing they could not remain adrift, he ordered a swim to a nearby islet. For hours, Kennedy towed an injured sailor by gripping his life jacket strap in his teeth, swimming through black water while Japanese patrols prowled nearby. Exhausted but determined, the survivors reached Plum Pudding Island, later nicknamed Kennedy Island. There they subsisted on coconuts, hiding by day and searching for help by night. Kennedy's leadership was decisive. He organized scouting swims, kept morale intact, and etched a message on a coconut shell, later delivered by Solomon Islanders allied with the Coast Watcher network. This message reached U.S. forces, leading to the survivors' rescue a week later. The incident quickly became emblematic of PT Boat's perilous service. Kennedy would receive the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions, while the story resonated across America, symbolizing resilience in the face of tragedy.
From the Japanese perspective, the incident barely registered. The Amagiri's ramming was not seen as extraordinary. Destroyers frequently encountered and engaged PT boats in the Solomons. Japanese officers considered the wooden craft vulnerable, an annoyance more than a threat. Yet what they overlooked was the propaganda power of such stories. PT-109's ordeal transformed the Mosquito fleet in the public imagination, proving that even in disaster, these small boats and their crews embodied courage. For the U.S. Navy, the loss of PT-109 highlighted both strengths and weaknesses. It demonstrated the boat's vulnerability in open water against destroyers, yet reinforced their effectiveness in ambush and interdiction roles. PTs were not meant to duel with fleet units, but to bleed supply lines. Still, the Kennedy episode galvanized interest in refining PT tactics, radar use, and coordination with aircraft to mitigate such risks. In the broader arc of the war, PT-109's fate was one story among many, but it carried enduring weight. The Japanese continued to lose barges and small craft at alarming rates, and Allied commanders recognized that PT boats had forced the enemy into costly adaptations. For Kennedy himself, the incident would one day shape his political career, his survival and leadership retold as a defining chapter in the journey from lieutenant to president. The tragedy of PT-109 thus stood as both a cautionary tale and a triumph of spirit. It underscored the Mosquito fleet's dangerous mission, small crews, fragile boats, immense risks, but also its indelible place in history. The Japanese Navy may have dismissed the craft, but the men who fought and sometimes died in them proved otherwise. The war in the Solomons pressed on, and with every barge sunk, every patrol endured, the Mosquito fleet tightened its grip on Japan's crumbling supply lines. As the Solomons campaign wound down in late 1943, the focus of the war shifted westward. The Allied advance pressed along the northern coast of New Guinea, where Japanese strongholds depended almost entirely on coastal barge traffic for survival. In these shallow, refilled waters, PT boats found yet another battlefield tailored to their strengths. By 1944, the Mosquito fleet was no longer an experiment. It had become an indispensable arm of the U.S. Navy's strategy. The Japanese faced a dire logistical reality. Allied aircraft and submarines made large convoys nearly impossible, while constant bombing destroyed supply depots and airfields. To feed garrisons at Wewak, Madong, and Hollandia, they relied on barges and small craft, often moving only at night, hugging coastlines to avoid detection. It was a desperate adaptation, but one that played straight into the Mosquito fleet's hands. PT squadrons operating from forward bases established with the rapid tempo of the New Guinea campaign prowled the shallows with radar and coast watch guidance. The hunting was relentless. Records from 13th Fighter Command showed that coordination between air units and PT squadrons grew increasingly sophisticated. Aircraft would spot barge movements and relay positions to boats, which raced to intercept under cover of darkness. In return, crews often lit targets with tracers and flares, guiding American bombers to strike. This symbiosis expanded the Mosquito fleet's role far beyond ambushes. They became integral to the broader Allied strategy of isolating Japanese garrisons. The Japanese, already cut off from major reinforcements, now watched their last lifelines vanish. The toll was staggering. By mid-1944, U.S. Navy reports credited PT squadrons along the New Guinea coast with sinking or destroying hundreds of barges, fuel lighters, and patrol craft. Action reports from PT-341 and PT-353 detailed close-range firefights where boats poured .5 caliber fire into packed barges until they erupted in flames. Crews described the seas littered with wreckage, oil fires burning for hours, and survivors desperately clinging to debris. For Japanese soldiers ashore, the loss of barges meant hunger and disease. Many units could no longer fight effectively, weakened by malnutrition and malaria, victims not only of air raids, but of PT interdiction. The Mosquito fleet also played a psychological role. Japanese commanders complained in post-war interrogations that PT boats created a constant sense of danger along supply routes. Their speed and unpredictability meant that barges could never travel with confidence. Even heavily armed escorts found it difficult to pin down the nimble craft, which could vanish into coastal shallows at will. As one Japanese officer recalled, it was as though the sea itself turned hostile. In October 1944, the Allies launched the Philippines campaign and PT boats moved once again to the front. Here, their mission expanded from barge hunting to convoy interdiction and support for landings. Based at Leyte and later Mindoro, they struck at Japanese shipping lines desperately trying to reinforce Luzon. Night after night, PTs ambushed convoys of troop barges and ammunition ships, sometimes under cover of American destroyers, but often alone. At Ormoc Bay, where Japanese reinforcements attempted to land under air attack, PT boats slashed into the fray, their torpedoes adding to the chaos that doomed the operation. The Japanese, increasingly short of ships, could ill afford these losses. Allied intelligence estimated that by late 1944, PT boats alone had accounted for well over 100 enemy craft in New Guinea and the Philippines. Barges, minesweepers, small transports all fell victim to their torpedoes and guns. For crews, the tempo was exhausting. Long patrols in typhoon seas, swarms of mosquitoes, and constant combat frayed nerves. Yet morale remained high. Sailors believed their small boats were crippling the enemy, and the results bore them out. By end of 1944, the Mosquito fleet had transformed from coastal irritant to strategic weapon. In both New Guinea and the Philippines, PTs had strangled Japanese supply lines so effectively that entire garrisons withered on the vine. The Japanese Navy, built for decisive battleship duels, had been humbled by wooden boats bristling with machine guns and torpedoes. The war was shifting inexorably towards its climax, and the Mosquito fleet had proven that small craft could wield enormous power when wielded with speed, daring, and relentless persistence. By 1945, the Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self. Carrier losses at Leyte Gulf and the sinking of the battleship Yamato signaled the collapse of Tokyo's ability to contest Allied sea power.
Naval power. Yet the war was not finished. Scattered garrisons still clung to the Philippines, Borneo, and the Ryukyus, relying on fragile supply lines to survive. It was here that the Mosquito fleet delivered its final, devastating blows. PT boats, now operating from dozens of forward bases, extended their patrols across the Philippine archipelago. They prowled the Surigao Strait, the Mindoro coast, and waters around Palawan. Their targets were no longer destroyers or heavy transports; those were gone. Instead, the PT squadrons hunted barges, luggers, sampans, and even small motorized junks. Every vessel that carried food, ammunition, or reinforcements became a legitimate target. By this stage of the war, PT boats rarely faced organized naval resistance, but they endured constant threats from shore batteries, aircraft, and mines. One striking episode came in January 1945, during the Lingayen Gulf landings.
PT boats provided screening against suicide boats, tiny Japanese craft laden with explosives, intended to ram Allied ships. The Mosquito fleet intercepted many before they could strike, using their own speed and maneuverability to outflank and destroy them. This new mission underscored the adaptability of PT crews. They were no longer just hunters of barges, but also guardians of invasion forces against desperate last-ditch attacks. In the southern Philippines, PT squadrons cut off Japanese retreat from Mindanao and interdicted traffic to Borneo. Reports from 13th Fighter Command show increasing coordination. PTs pinned enemy vessels along the coast while aircraft strafed from above. The Japanese 10th Area Fleet admitted in post-war interrogations that they had been unable to move supplies in meaningful quantities by 1945, an admission that highlighted the Mosquito fleet's role in choking lifelines already strained by air and submarine campaigns. The price, however, remained high. Kamikaze aircraft targeted PT bases, and wooden hulls offered little protection against strafing runs. Crews fought under constant fatigue, often spending 10 hours a night on patrol before returning to refuel and reload for the next. Yet the sense of finality was palpable. Victory was near, and the Mosquito fleet knew its work was helping to bring Japan to collapse. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, PT boats had destroyed or assisted in the destruction of nearly 200 enemy vessels across the Pacific. Their victims ranged from barges and supply ships to patrol craft and transports. Small in number, fragile in design, but immense in impact, the Mosquito fleet had proven that war could be waged not only by battleships and carriers, but by plywood hulls bristling with machine guns and crewed by men who fought every night in the shadows. The Japanese Navy had never expected them to matter, yet in the end they had helped starve an empire. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was littered with wrecks. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, barges, and junks alike. Among the many instruments of Japan's defeat, few had been as unlikely as the small wooden PT boats. Conceived in skepticism, forged in desperation, they ended the war with a combat record that astonished even their own commanders. Nearly 200 Japanese vessels destroyed. Countless others harassed, delayed, or driven back. For an enemy that had built its strategy on vast steel armadas, this was a humiliation they had never anticipated. In the months following surrender, Allied intelligence teams interviewed Japanese naval officers. Again and again, the same theme emerged. They had never expected such fragile craft to exact such a heavy toll. Destroyers sent to resupply garrisons found themselves dodging phantom torpedoes in the night. Barges slipped from shorelines only to be cut down by machine gun fire before they could deliver food to starving troops. "They forced us to fight on their terms," one officer admitted, "and by then we had no answer." For the Americans who served in them, PT boats became symbols of audacity. Veterans recalled the stench of fuel-soaked decks, the constant rattle of Packard engines, and the blinding tracers of nighttime duels. Their war had been fought at close quarters, where courage mattered as much as steel. Many never returned home. Others carried memories of burning wrecks and desperate rescues for the rest of their lives. At reunions years later, they spoke of camaraderie that could only be forged in the nightly crucible of the Pacific. Strategically, the Mosquito fleet's greatest contribution was its cost-effectiveness. For a fraction of the price of a destroyer, a squadron of PT boats could paralyze enemy supply lines. In the confined waters of the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines, they proved indispensable. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that PT interdiction imposed losses disproportionate to their size and armament, and accelerated the isolation of forward garrisons. In other words, they did exactly what their designers had hoped: deliver outsized impact with minimal investment. Yet their legacy was not measured only in statistics. The stories, Bulkeley's expedition of MacArthur, Kennedy's survival with PT-109, the endless barge hunts under fire, captured the imagination of a nation. They demonstrated that victory did not depend solely on the might of battleships or carriers, but also on the ingenuity of small craft and the bravery of ordinary sailors. Against all odds, the Mosquito fleet became a symbol of resilience, striking fear into an enemy that had once dismissed them as irrelevant. After the war, the PTs were retired, their plywood hulls no match for the jet age. Some were scrapped, others sold off, a few preserved as memorials. But their place in history was secure. In the vast sweep of the Pacific War, they had proven that size was not destiny, and that determination, speed, and daring could topple even the most formidable fleets. For the Japanese Navy, the lesson came too late. For the men of the Mosquito fleet, it was a legacy etched forever in saltwater and fire. In the quiet after victory, their story stood as proof that sometimes the smallest ships can leave the largest wake.